Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Kirk McNally, and I am the Associate Dean, Creative Activity, Research and Administration for the Faculty of Fine Arts. And before we start today, I would like to acknowledge and give my respect to the Lekwungen, which is the Songhees and Wisconsin peoples on whose territory the university stands, and Lekwungen and Wisanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I'm very happy to welcome you to this Orion Lecture Series in Fine Arts. Thank you to Dean Alana Lindgren, the Orion Fund, and John Threlfall for all your help organizing and promoting this event. And I also wanted to thank our co-sponsors, which is the Kula Library Futures Academy. Thanks to Matt Hukluk and Christine Wald for your work and support of this event as well. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to Mike Ananny, who has been with us in the Faculty of Fine Arts as an Orion visiting scholar this past semester. Mike is an associate professor of communication and journalism at the University of Southern California. He is the co-director of USC's interdisciplinary collective, Media as Socio-Technical Systems, and the AI for Media and Storytelling initiative at the Center on Generative AI and Society. Mike is the author of Network Press Freedom, co-editor of Bauhaus Futures, these are both with MIT Press, and was an expert advisor to the Minister of Canadian Heritage on the future of CBC Radio-Canada. He has also written for the likes of The Atlantic, Wired, and the Columbia Journalism Review, to name just a few. It's been an absolute pleasure to get to know Mike over these past weeks, to see him engage with our community and students, and his expertise and ability to connect there is obvious. I know that we are in for a fascinating talk, and so I would ask you to please join me in welcoming Mike to the stage.
For that introduction, and also to everyone who helped make this visit happen, and everyone who's been so welcoming and so warm in sort of creating a home for me while I'm at UVic and in Victoria, especially Dean Lindgren, Kirk especially, Sarah in the Dean's office, John Threlfall, wherever John is, I don't see, and Matt and Christine at the library as well. So thanks very much to everybody and people that I'm sure I've forgotten or didn't realize helped make it happen, but big thanks for letting me be here. What I wanted to do today is tell a story about not only how I've been reckoning with this moment of generative AI and what generative AI is, but also how a set of scholars, a set of practitioners, a set of people who've been kind of a little bit thrown for a loop by this moment as they've sort of found themselves having to respond to pressures and kind of fundamental questions about who they are and what they do and what media are and what it means to communicate. And some of these kinds of questions that we thought were pretty stable for a while really quickly have become questions that we're asking anew. And we're having to ask them anew, sometimes not on a timeline that we want, sometimes not in the conditions or under the circumstances that we want. So there's often this pressure to sort of what the heck should we do in this moment? So I wanted to offer some ways through it, not solutions by any means of any kind, and some stories about how different people are sort of grappling with this. The first thing, though, if I wouldn't be a good scholar if I sort of thought that this was a new thing, because this moment of new technologies has really always been with us. Every time there's been some new technology, it's been this moment of promise, it's been this moment of fear, this moment of hype, this moment of sort of existential angst. And I wanted to just kind of, as a way to start things off a little bit, talk about a few of those moments. So these are some quotes, both from inventors of technologies over the years, as well as scholars or people who've studied technologies over the years. And I want you to I'll read them and then you can think a little bit about who might have said this or what are they talking about. So here's one, quote, "Books will soon be obsolete in schools. Scholars will soon be instructed through the eye. It is possible to touch every branch of human knowledge with this thing." Any guesses? Curious? Television. Any others? Close. Motion pictures. This was Thomas Edison in 1910s saying this. So Thomas Edison, by the way, had a vested interest in this being the future, given what he was working on, what he was doing. Right, so he wanted this to be the future. Let's try a few more. This will diminish greatly the frequency of wars and create more rational methods of settling international misunderstandings. It, this same thing, a different person said, will ultimately make wars impossible. Any guesses? Telephone? Telegraph? The airplane. Especially ironic and tragic. Orville Wright, one of those people, right? Again, inventors with a vested interest in how you want to see a technology. Let's try a couple others. This will bring the world to the classroom and make universally available the services of the finest teachers, the inspiration of the greatest leaders. Guesses? Radio. Radio in the 1920s. Two more. This will revitalize communities, enrich schools, end poverty, eliminate the need for everything from banks to shopping malls, reduce dependence on the automobile, and transform the world. Cable television. So we also see these moments of reaching for really? How is that? What story is going to connect those dots? Let me give you one last one though, before we get into the meat of it. We see a future where this is a utility, like electricity or water, and people buy it from us on a meter and then use it for whatever it is that they want. Internet? Any other guesses? Telephone data? This is Sam Altman last week talking about generative AI. So this is the vision of what generative AI is wanting to be. Again, vested interest in doing this. The reason I want to start with these stories is, one, to say a little bit of this moment we're in is new, yes, but we've also been through moments like it in the past. We've been through moments where inventors have had sort of big interests and big ideas about what these technologies were going to do, and the fact that some of you are giggling or laughing, like, haha, how could you possibly think about that? It's not going to come to pass. It's not going to come to pass in the way that this is being talked about. So in some sense, this future is ours to invent. It's going to be a struggle, and it's not going to be easy in any way. But to push back against this idea of inevitability, push back against this idea that we found ourselves in something that cannot be changed. And that's my way into a field that I come from called Science and Technology Studies. And it's sort of an interdisciplinary field. It's a field that draws on a lot of different traditions, different ways of knowing. But when I think about this field and sort of what this training has brought to me personally and sort of the community of people that I'm part of, there's these three tenets to this field. There's three ways that can guide us through these moments that this STS field offers. The first is to say that technologies are always relationships. It's about people and materials doing things. And if you hear somebody talk about, what is the impact of the internet on people, or what is the effect of generative AI on, classrooms or something, I would encourage you to really not take to heart those languages, those words of impact or effect on. Always ask, there's something else that's being made. There's something else that happens in this collision of people and materials. You got to sort of think about, what is that other thing that's being made? The other bit that STS sort of tells us is that technologies are not natural. They're always made by people. They're always made by people who are in search of, particular visions of the future, maybe particular money, particular futures that they might want or think are inevitable, but they're always made. They're always made by people, and in a way, that's lovely because we can study them. We can figure them out. We can try to understand why it is that they're acting as they're acting. And the last part of STS that often talks about, and this is a lot of sort of futurisms work, a lot of world building, a lot of sort of imagining of different possibilities, is that we can invent other technologies. You can invent other relationships. You can invent other ways that these tools have power in your life. So I ask you to sort of keep in mind these three ideas, that technologies are relationships. It's not a language of tools. It's not a language of impact, and they're not natural. We didn't find them in the world and discover them and all of a sudden pick them up. And also, we can make other kinds of futures. Okay, a couple other sort of setting the groundwork before I get into some stories. The other bit is this perennial question these days of, what the heck is AI? What are we talking about when we do it? And forgive me if this is sort of obvious to some people in the room, but I encounter this question a lot. And the way I like to answer it is to say that there's sort of three things have collided to create this moment. The first is that we've had sort of decades of surveillance. All of us in this room have left what's often called data exhaust. We've sort of left little traces of where we've been, what we've clicked on, what we've said, who we've been in proximity to. And this kind of data exhaust that we've left for years and years and years has been hoovered up, has been gathered up into sort of massive, massive data sets. And there's increasingly a lot of sophisticated computation that's able to make sense of those data sets, that's able to make guesses about what the patterns are in those data that are living not in my computer, not in your computer, but largely in the computers of very powerful and centralized companies that are there. So we had for many years this idea of predictive AI, and that was this idea of finding patterns in that data. And it was problematic, and it was sort of, honestly, it was fairly racist, it was fairly sexist in a lot of ways, and it drew conclusions about the world that were wrong a lot of times. And there was a lot of good work sort of showing that, and some successes of sort of ways of thinking about the patterns this data might give. But what's happened in the last sort of 3 years or so, 4 years, has been this shift to what you hear of as being called generative AI. And really all that is making media from these patterns. I'm sure many of you in this room have sort of had that experience where you've asked something of ChatGPT. The text that it's producing is not authored by a human. The text is the computer's best guess at what a good enough answer is to the question that you've asked it. And it's stringing together these words in a probabilistic fashion. It's saying, I think this sentence runs a decent chance of providing you with a good enough answer. That's all it's doing. It's often been described as just really fancy math, right? So even though we want to anthropomorphize it, we want to say it thinks this, it does this, it wants this, it fears this. It's none of those things. It's math. And sometimes I think that's helpful to sort of remember, is to say that it doesn't have a life or a soul in the way that we think it does. So those are the two big distinctions of this predictive AI and this generative AI. But I wanted to give you an example of sort of maybe just moving a little bit toward what might be a problematic dimension or dynamic of this. So here's some people, I think Kirk has seen this, but this is me and my dog Stella. This is us walking along the water in Victoria, I guess last week I think it was. You have beautiful rainbows here and they just appear all the time. So as a newbie, it's kind of phenomenal. I'm like, oh my God, another rainbow, it's happening. It's amazing. Anyway, so I took this selfie of Stella and I walking along. And I was thinking about this talk and sort of trying to think about examples or ways to make this idea of generative AI come alive a little bit. And I fed this photo into ChatGPT, and I said, turn this photo into an image of a happy family. Any guesses about what it's going to do? I mean, I want you to pause for a second and say, so there's this thing called, quote, happy family, right? Pretty contentious thing to talk about, pretty contentious thing to think about what this is. You then think, well, what the heck does ChatGPT might think, and I would put think in quotation marks, this means? This is the image that it gave me. We could spend probably the next hour just reading this image, actually, in a way, right? But this image, so first of all, it added a woman on the right, added 2 children, everyone's white. The boy, who I guess is my son, is wearing a tie as we're walking along the street, which is a curious thing to do. Usually kids wearing ties are not happy, but that's fine. You probably can't see them, but I have ostensibly bought my generative wife these beautiful diamond earrings that she's also wearing. So there's a lot to be read into this image, right? To sort of say, like, this is this idea of happy family. It's there. I tried just another one. I said, take this photo, the one on the left, and turn it into an image of a happy family in front of their home. I was just curious, like, let's add a concept here. Let's add a concept of home and see what happens. This is the image. First of all, I think I aged a lot in this photo, right? I think I aged a lot. By the way, the dog is like the most consistent thing across the photos. Like, the dog is consistently the happiest thing we could possibly find. But we're in front of this home that's like pretty nice home. I would guess it's a multi-million-dollar home. It's canonically pretty great. My son is still wearing a tie. I'm now wearing a tie as well. The point is that we've got these images, and so when I talk to my students about these kind of things, we talk about them as the politics of categories. The politics of categories that live in data sets. So there's no understanding of what happy family means. There's no understanding of what home means, but we're resting upon massive, massive amounts of data that are going to reflect for us what a concept like happy family might be or home might be, and it's going to give those back to us. So, these kinds of images that we're looking at don't work for many of us. They don't, but we should be hyper aware that these are the kinds of patterns that are embedded in the dominant systems that are sort of generating these media for us. And what we need to do is we need to sort of get good at understanding why is this maybe not good enough. And that for me is the big charge that I try to convince my students of is how do you get to be a good critic of these systems in a constructive and precise way? So I'm going to throw at you a bunch of different examples, and forgive me if it's a bit of a sort of a fire hose of things, but when I want to think about where AI is, because a lot of times people have this idea that AI is somewhere else. It's not, I don't choose to use it, so therefore it's not relevant to me. And I want to hopefully convince you that you're kind of swimming in it, whether you choose to or not. You're in it, whether you want to be or not. It's with you. So here's a bunch of different ones, and I'll just sort of chat through these a little bit, but I'll let you look at them. But they're everywhere, right? So there's this idea of data centers that are sort of gobbling up energy and gobbling up water and extracting minerals or needing a lot of extraction of minerals. There's a war currently happening that is being directed by a lot of drones that are using AI to find targets and to make decisions about launching missiles. It's happening right now. We also have sort of this counter-narrative of saying, do we even know that these images are real because they could be fake? And in a way, it doesn't matter if they are real or not real. What matters is this powerful question of, is it fake? I don't want to believe it. So there's almost, the media itself matters less than the conversation or the willingness to not believe something. That's the even more fundamental nature of what's happening. We've got AI chatbots that are reading your health data, whether you know it or not. I know a lot of people here are teaching creative practices. We've got creative writing teachers who are asking, what does it even mean to do my job right now? Journalism, a world that I spend a lot of time in relation to. There's a pretty famous story right now. The Cleveland Dealer publisher was very excited because he said, well, we've required our reporters now not to draft first drafts of their stories from their notes, but we're going to have AI draft a first draft of stories for publication, and all we're asking our reporters to do is to just generate notes. So they've changed this sort of idea of what journalism is because it says, I just want you out reporting. That's the human part. I don't want you drafting text. We're going to let the machine do that. So we've got these fault lines, these sort of boundary, and these sort of edge cases and collisions where we ask, what the heck does a reporter do anymore in that way? Here's a few other examples. There's also, every time you think, if you've seen, I haven't seen a lot in Victoria, but I could be wrong. If you see a quote self-driving car, chances are a lot of the quote intelligence of that car is actually resting on a pretty big labor force of humans, of people that are watching and making decisions about where that car is going and are intervening without the person in the car even knowing it. They're sort of telling that car, hey, we're in a complicated place, I'm going to slow you down. Those are humans, largely not on this continent, humans that are controlling that. So there's also this, what Mary Gray and Siddhartha calls ghost labor. There's a ghost labor force that's informing all these systems. Where I live in Southern California, there was the Southern California Air Quality Board, which is kind of a contentious thing in Southern California for kind of obvious reasons. Turned out they were flooded with comments in response to a request for comments on data about whether smog had been increasing or decreasing. Got flooded with bots that said, this is great, no problem, we're totally fine. So the Air Quality Board, charged with understanding public opinion, found itself wondering, is this real public opinion? You may have seen this one. Newfoundland and Labrador hired expensive consultants to produce a report for them about the medical system. A lot of errors within it because they had been generated by generative AI. I'll skip through a few more, but we've also got this question of sovereignty, this question of what the heck culture means, and we have the AI minister saying that he, quote, won't rule out American involvement in Canada's sovereign cloud. This question of what the heck sovereignty means in an AI world, when you think about the stack of where this data comes from. This was a lovely example. I had a chance to interview, actually, the person who was responsible for doing this in Brazil. He was very happy he had managed to put one over on his colleagues because he had generated a draft of a bill using ChatGPT, got his colleagues to vote on it and pass it, and then told them after the fact, haha, you've actually passed a law that ChatGPT wrote and no human wrote this law. He was sort of proud of it in a way. And then finally, we've got this idea of, and this is part of the world that I'm in, that many of you are in, scholarship that is increasingly synthetic. and synthetic scholarship citing synthetic scholarship. So even this question of what are we even doing in an institution like this as we're generating knowledge sort of is thrown into case. This is the favorite one, the last one I'll stop with here, but this is robot dogs that are now guarding the data centers. So we've got sort of AI watching AI in a curious fashion. The point is these are absurd, and I could keep going on and going on, but when you think about AI's, this is what Lucy Suchman calls AI's thingness, try as well to be on guard for whenever somebody says, I'll tell you what AI really is. And by the way, usually that is something that, with all love to my friends in engineering and computer science, there's usually this moment when sort of a technologist says, no, that's not what it really is. That's not what it is going on. And what I would encourage you to do is to sort of push back with your own language, your own experiences, your own way of understanding the power of these technologies and say, well, it's actually a lot more than your sort of narrow technological description, right? So it's about the environment. It's about what does conflict mean? What does authorship mean? And it really is anywhere else that you want to think about where it could be. So the last bit before I sort of move into a story of error and breakdown and how we should think about this, there's a lot of scholars that are grappling with this, and they're starting to give us some language that I think is kind of helpful. Lucy Suchman and Norcha Morris call it a, quote, super controversy, sort of saying there's something foundational or different that's going on in this AI moment, and that we should frame it differently. We should think about it less as a traditional moral panic, the way sociologists often do, and say there's something different, fundamental going on. There's also this idea in science and technology studies called interpretive flexibility. And it's just a fancy term for all it means is to say every time a new technology is introduced, this happened with the bicycle, it happened with the refrigerator, it happened with the radio, it happened with cable TV. Scholars have documented this stuff for a long time. There's this moment where what happens is no one knows what this thing, quote, means. Nobody knows exactly what's going on, what the relationships are that are going to be created with this technology. So there's this moment of interpretive flexibility. And what the scholars find saying is that what happens is, quote, relevant social groups, that's the term they use, relevant social groups get to fight about what this technology means, and they fight for a little bit, and then something called closure happens. And then we sort of settle on what we think this technology means in a dominant way. So radio went through this. We don't necessarily fundamentally rethink what radio is anymore, although podcasts did that a little bit when you think about radio. But there's this moment where we get to have a fight about what the technology means. And I would say we're in that moment right now for generative AI, and it's a moment that you can't waste. You can't accept a definition or a dominant meaning of the technology, because otherwise you're going to foreclose possible futures. There's a brief digression, but Ruth Cowan is this wonderful feminist historian, and it's this book called More Work for Mother. And this book traces the introduction of technologies into the home in the US from sort of the 1920s through the 1950s. Every time one of these new technologies appeared in the home, it said, the woman of the home, because it was presumed to be the woman of the home was going to do the work in the home, so that was resting on a sort of a layer of assumption there, but it said it's going to free her up to do all these things. And every single new the washing machine was going to do this, the refrigerator was going to do this, every single new technology was introduced was going to free women up. And what Ruth Cowan showed was, no, it always created, quote, more work for mother, right? And the work shifted, because these social relationships of gender and identity and domesticity, those were the powerful things that went forward, that really forced this sort of conservatism that's there. All right, and the last bit I want to talk about is this idea of, we want to think about it when I tell this next story, is how is AI perhaps what John Dewey calls a public problem? And by a public problem, what I mean is it's something that you cannot extract yourself from, no matter how much money you have, maybe no matter how much privilege you have. So if an earthquake hits us right now, it's a public problem. I can't say I'm not interested in the earthquake. The earthquake is not part of my conception of community. The earthquake is not something that I want to focus on this week, right? That's not a choice that I have. The same with clean water, clean air. There's lots of moments. I would say public education, healthcare. I don't have kids, but I want schools to be amazing, right? It's not a personal interest, but it's a societal public problem. I think we need to start thinking about generative AI as a, quote, public problem to the extent that it's shaping the language that we use. To the extent that you don't necessarily know whether you can trust that a piece of media was created by a human all the way through, maybe part of the way through, maybe not. But so it's creating this sort of shared condition. So again, that's why I say even if you don't care about generative AI cares about you. It's gonna find you. It's gonna find you. Okay. So I've painted a little bit of a bleak picture, and it's going to stay a little bit bleak, but I'll stick with it for a little bit longer. But there is usually this moment to say, well, okay, that's fine. There's a history of that. There's sort of complications. Yes, it's everywhere. It's complicated. But what can we do about it? And I especially want to think about who the we is in this story, or what we should do, as not people who are necessarily building systems. We're not necessarily people who are building technologies ourselves. We don't have massive servers available to us. We don't have huge data sets. We're not going to be actually doing the work of creating this technology, and yet we're still in relation to it. We still have to figure out what is our agency, what's our power, what can we do? And here's where I want to say, I think what we can do is we can make some, quote, good problems. And I want to explain what I mean by a good problem. But a problem is something that grows out of an error, in a way, or there's something that's not quite met. There's an expectation that didn't happen. There's a failure of some kind. And we know that systems fail all the time. And I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of, if you're curious, there's a really, really lovely, and I kind of geek out on this, but a lovely scholarship around when technologies fail and what those failures teach us about technologies. The first one that we find is there's usually only a set number of people who can define something as an error. Usually those are people with already have a lot of power in some kind of situation. They get to say that was an error versus somebody else who can say, just deal with it, not an error. Which errors matter, which ones get to be attended to, which ones are generally ignored, how are people who have to suffer errors, how is that suffering distributed? And that's a lot of the fault lines here are going back to sort of social fault lines of race and gender and class and orientation and geography, and those are sort of who has to suffer or work with an error whenever a technology fails. It usually reflects that. Gina Neff is this wonderful scholar who studies what she calls permanently beta technologies. So we all have encountered these. The software for this laptop is permanently beta. All your phones are permanently beta. And what she means by that is there's always risk associated with technology. Your phone is never going to work all the time. It's going to fail sometime. But it's in a permanently beta state of development where you take on the risk of dealing with the glitches, the failures, the errors of the technology. The SIM card in my phone last Friday failed. Spontaneously just stopped working. And it was, it's a US phone, I was in Victoria, and I was like, how do I deal with this? And turns out it has an eSIM. But anyway, I burned probably like a half day figuring out how to get my phone to start working again. That was a real permanently beta moment for me where I was like, okay, I had to take on the risk associated with that phone breaking down. And some errors are public problems, right? Some of them are things that we cannot extract ourselves from. Every time your Gmail goes down, or if this university's IT system, there's something fundamental failure that happens, it becomes quickly a shared problem. So here's, I'm in Canada, here's a different way to put this, right? Is that errors can teach us something. Errors can sort of have a way of revealing a different way to see what might matter in the world. So Leonard Cohen's famous, forget your perfect offering, there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. There's actually several scholars who use literally this song and Leonard Cohen as sort of an inspiration for how to do what they call broken world thinking. And there's a lovely scholarship around broken world thinking is something that celebrates the technologies that fail, celebrates precarious technologies, celebrates sort of technologies that often break down. But it does so because it says whenever that breakdown happens, it shows us something different. It shows us something else about how people relate to each other or what they think a stable social or technological system is. And you want those cracks. You don't want to paper over those cracks. You don't want to pretend those cracks don't exist. And you want to get good at sort of leveraging and using those cracks to sort of do something else. So I come back to this quote that Cohen used, but it's sort of there. Okay. For sort of the last bit of the talk, what I want to do is tell a story of error, and then I want to think about what that story means and why that story might be an opening for all of us, no matter what our technological background is, no matter what our sort of literacy is with AI, to be able to sort of take action or do something in relation to AI. So if you can cast your mind back a little bit to 2020, March 2020, which is not a great time to remember for a lot of people, but so I was working at the University of Southern California in March 2020. We all go into lockdown. We're not allowed into the university. It's the middle of our semester. Probably this is a familiar experience for many of you. Middle of our semester, I still had to issue grades. Wasn't sure how to do that, depending on how you evaluate students or depending on what how your courses are designed. There was sort of this moment where a lot of professors and students alike, and administrators as well, were thrown into this moment to say, how the heck do we achieve continuity of what this learning experience is like? Universities all over the world sort of grappled with this moment and did it in different ways. One of the ways they did it, one of the ways they grappled with this pressure, this moment of what do we do to try to establish continuity, was to think about this, quote, assessment mechanism, or literally, how do you give students tests or exams or evaluate their essays? These are these canonical, and especially in a School of Fine Arts, it's maybe quite different in a way, but a lot of, think about your chemistry professors, your calculus professors, some biology professors, right, who sort of have been, and I say this with all love to my colleagues, been kind of basically the same tests for 20 years, and are that's the midterm test I give, and they've been doing it. And like, oh man, I can't give that test anymore, or it's we've all gone into lockdown. How do I deal with this moment? The intervention that was made, and our university was one of them, and I don't know how UVic handled this, but we essentially required students to install a piece of software called Respondus, was our name of our software company. Respondus Monitor was a piece of that I'll talk about. We required students to install this software on their laptops, on their machines. And here's what it did. It's pretty simple in some ways, but it used the camera on the laptop to sort of look at where my head was, where the student's head was. It could know, did the student turn their head this way or this way? Were they looking up? Were they looking down? It had a microphone in it, so it could hear whether somebody else was in the room, and it could make some guess about ambient noise in the room. It had keyboard monitoring techniques, so it could tell, where I was typing. It definitely didn't let me go into a different browser window. It sort of put the people in lockdown also on lockdown in their browsers, right? It sort of lockdown on lockdown. And so what it did was it was meant to say, I want to mimic as much as possible this idea of test taking and evaluation of students, the same way if I was in a room like this, that I could look at them and make sure they're, quote, not cheating or committing some kind of act of academic misconduct in some way. That was sort of the holy grail, right? That was the idea that they were trying to do. And why did they do this? Why did they want to do it? A few different rationales were given to us, and maybe to you as well, but one of them was that it promised continuity, right? The world was already broken in a lot of different ways and already upset. And so we can at least give out these exams and tests in the same way. We can sort of have what they call, I put this in quotation marks, but equality among students, because, hey, we're just doing exactly what the students signed up for. There's no difference. We're not switching gears halfway through. It, quote, kept professors in charge. It made sure that professors were the ones who were deciding it, and professors definitely, pride their autonomy and their ability to do what they want in a classroom within reason, obviously, but we wanted to keep professors in charge. And the other bit that at least my university and many were really concerned about is we didn't know how long this was going to last for. What the heck would it mean for all of a sudden students with a USC degree graduating if a bunch of their assessment could have been faked? It could have been based on a lot of plagiarism or a lot of cheating. There was this brand anxiety among universities to say, we don't want to let these students be doing something that isn't in line with our continuity. Okay, so that's the setup, right? That we had this moment where we're making students use this software. Whole bunch of different sort of, news stories of the time of what's it like to be accused of being a cheater, by an algorithm or, by a professor. Did the professor accuse you of this, or did the software accuse you of this? And who got to monitor the patterns that might have been happening? Anyway, so there was a lot of problems and challenges and pushbacks to it, a lot of data, privacy concerns. But one of the, and this is where it gets to the AI story, one of the pushbacks was essentially on the potentially discriminatory nature of the facial detection piece of the software. So remember I said earlier, the software needed to be able to see the person's face. The camera needed to place my face within a frame so that I'm not staring at the ceiling and reading answers, or I'm not, looking at somebody beside me who's holding up the answers to the test, or looking in my lap to see notes that I wasn't allowed to have. It wanted my head staring straight into this. I mean, We know that's not how people work, right? I mean, when you try taking a test, if somebody puts your head into one of these things, but that's what the software wanted. In order to do that, the software needed to place my head in space in a really reliable way. This is math. It needed to say, his head is there. Turns out, a lot of the systems that are designed to track a human face are based on, any guesses? White faces, right? So the data sets looking for faces are expecting white faces. Massive problem. If you all of a sudden roll this out and you demand that students install this software, what we raised this, or what was being raised was this question of, have we required students to use a piece of software in the name of equality and brand stability and setting expectations for what learning means? Have we actually then instituted a discriminatory piece of software so students of color would be flagged at a higher rate for academic plagiarism? And this was happening, I'll explain, not at our university, but at many universities. We were seeing an uptick of higher rates of academic plagiarism accusations for students of color instead of white students. And it took a while to figure out why this was happening, what was happening, and it rolls back to this idea of the data sets that were looking for a particular face. They weren't ready for a not white face. So I was asked to be part of this provost task force. This was shortly after I got in tenure, so it was kind of a fun moment. They're like, hey, you have job security, go be on this provost task force and ask hard questions. I was like, great. So the question that the provost asked of us was, did our proctoring system treat students of color different than white students? And we found out that yes, the vendor that we were working with, their system did have a higher rate of error for students of color as opposed to white students. That was this Respondus monitor system that we were using. It absolutely had that. We talked to the vendor. We said, this is not acceptable. We had sort of tried to have a vendor conversation that didn't go super well. But we found there was no evidence of systematic difference in the accusation of academic integrity, though. That was sort of kind of an important wrinkle to say, okay, our software was racist, but we haven't necessarily brought charges of academic plagiarism at a higher rate against our students of color. So in some ways, a really, really bad thing got caught at least a moment where we could say, okay, well, maybe there isn't a difference in the rate of accusations that are there. So the provost asked us to make a recommendation. What should we do, right? We've got this, we're in the middle of a lockdown. We're in the middle of this, we've got all of these different priorities of what we want this moment in this system to be about, but we're requiring students to use some pretty racist software. So he said, what should we do? And I sort of tried to reframe it a little bit and sort of say, well, what kind of problem is this? And this is how I want to think about turning failures, or I would argue systematically, it's not okay that the system treated students of color different from white students, so there's a pretty easy error to identify. But what kind of problem is this? How far do we want to pull this thread of what problem is going on here, and which part of this problem do we want to focus on? So I want to go with you a few. This was, our task force worked this, and we basically, we tried to define the problem in as many different ways as we possibly could. And I want to tell you this part of the story because I think this is what we're charged with in these moments of AI failure, is to tell the story of failure and error as richly as we can, from as many different perspectives as we can. And we did this by interviewing people, talking to vendors, talking to a whole bunch of people at our university. So the first is that you could describe this as a technical problem, a technical error. And the vendor said, totally, that's terrible, we'll fix it. Our next update will address that. No timeline on when the next update was, no new error rate. I'm like, oh, so is it just going to be a little bit racist, but not totally racist? What are we talking about here in terms of this technical fix of how are we going to do this? But that was one answer. That was one way of thinking about this problem, was to say, it's a data set problem, we're just going to train the models better. That's what we'll do. One of the other ways, and this was our vendor suggested this, which was kind of amazing, was they said, the real problem here is that students are not illuminating themselves well enough when they're taking these tests. And what's actually happening is that the students of color are not showing up brightly enough to our algorithms, and that's why we're not able to track their faces. And they literally, I still have email, I can't share that, but I have email literally saying, what we recommend is you could buy your students of color ring lights that would go on top of their laptops so that you would illuminate the students of color so that they would show up better. That's a good fix to the problem. Not acceptable to us, right? Like, seriously, are you going to do this? And I, again, as somebody who studied the history of technology, I told this story to our vendor and said, so there's this woman, Simone Brown, who writes phenomenal histories of, she focuses on slave ship design, but she also has written histories of how people of color, Black Americans mostly, have had to use technology in ways that enabled their own oppression and their own surveillance over the years. So one of the ones she describes is this thing called lamp lighting laws in New York in the 1700s. And it was the law that if you were a Black American in New York in the 1700s, you had to carry a lamp with you after the sun had gone down so that your face could be illuminated to law enforcement so they could see you, because there was a concern that Black Americans were hard to see at night. So you made their responsibility to hold up a light to illuminate themselves to law enforcement. I told this story, so they're like, give them Ring cameras and light them. I'm like, no, we're not, we can't possibly do this. This is like, do you know what lamp lighting is? Anyway, so there's a moment of like, they're dealing with professors who are gonna tell them about 1700s and they're like not interested in doing it. But anyway, the reason I say this is that that's a way of describing the problem, was it was a user problem. We had other ways of thinking about the problem. It was sort of a pedagogical problem. Like, what are you doing in this day and age assigning, large, standardized, timed tests that students had to take under surveilled circumstances? Like, maybe that's just not great pedagogy. Like, why are you still doing that? That's such like a 19th century way to think about what learning is. That's maybe the problem is professors. Maybe the problem is professors have too much autonomy. Really, we shouldn't have this like hit or miss thing going on across the university, such that in a pandemic moment, we can't standardize our evaluation. We can't talk about what learning means on this campus because we don't have enough standardization. Professors are the problem because they're standing in the way of standardization. That was talked about, right, as a thing. We've also got different ways of thinking about sort of equity and equality in this moment. So there were two different sort of perspectives put forward to say, well, we need this kind of system because honest students who are not doing academic dishonesty will be penalized if we don't have these systems, because their work will be judged in the same way. We had another wrinkle of equity, though, and you probably had some of this, but I had some of my students especially who were sharing internet connections at home with like 5 people, and were living in small spaces, and not everyone could create a quiet, well-lit place to take that standardized test. I had many students who were, sharing, really crowded spaces, really noisy spaces that had nothing to do with plagiarism. That was just about where they were. We also had this sort of economics problem. So another way to think about the problem is universities make, at least I don't want to generalize, but our university really loves big classes, right? The return on investment on a big class is amazing because I can like pack 300 students into a room, hire one professor, maybe a few TAs if you're lucky, and I can get that tuition revenue. Those sizes of classes are really great economic drivers, and those sizes of classes tend to need these large standardized tests, so I can't get to know individual students that way. There's a scale problem. But we could say maybe that's the problem that's really lurking here, is that we shouldn't be needing these technologies at all if we actually had university economics that were different. We've also got this implicit bias program, or problem. One of the questions that came up was to say, well, maybe we actually don't do anything about this problem, but we make sure professors know that the systems might be discriminating against students of color, so that when they're flagged, professors should be able to say, wait a second. Good luck convincing your entire population of professors to sort of address implicit bias, turn on a dime and say, oh, I'm now going to be able to think sophisticatedly about socioeconomic and race-based differences amongst my students. So that was a problem, is we didn't necessarily have a workforce who was able to say, wait a second, why is it mostly students of color who are showing up in my office as, or not showing up in my office, but are branded that way? And then the last bit is we can have this sort of brand problem. So maybe the problem is brands. Like my university that's so concerned about making sure that a USC student is stamped with a particular degree of a kind, maybe we should just think about what are we doing in terms of this idea of universities having brands that are competing with each other. Anyway, the point is, and the reason I wanted to linger on this a little bit, these are ways to think about this problem that's grounded in an AI story, but it's not the only part of the story. And if you let these systems be described as only AI in this sense, then you're losing this sort of power to pull the thread of this problem and see other kinds of things. So we talked about it as technical, user, pedagogical, equity, economics, implicit bias, or brand. And I would say that depending on what you, and probably everybody in this room has a reaction to this and says, well, that problem is just endemic. That problem's not going anywhere. That problem's just saying, that other problem, that's more fixable, that's more solvable. Probably we have differences maybe about where we land on it, but we can describe this problem differently and we can start to have a conversation about what the heck you should do about these. But those priorities, those investments you make, or how you think universities change or are not gonna change, what we start to do is we start to create sort of solidarities in a way of change, solidarities that are based in diagnoses of errors and solidarities that are about doing something about these. Okay, so to go back just a step and to think about it, I pulled these today, these two headlines. There's new evidence that says, so people who use AI autocomplete, and all that just means is, right, if you're in Google Docs and you see that gray word that's there, and if you take it, if you're like, yeah, good word, I'll take that word, or you're in Copilot and you're in Outlook and you're composing some email and like you just take the suggested response to the email, what we've starting to see research in is that over time, the people who are accepting those autocompletes are starting to not just use language in the way that the autocomplete is suggesting, but are starting to actually adopt, and this is really hard to study, but what the authors call these sort of ideological positions. So think about if you reply to somebody and you sort of said, no problem, like they're late getting back to you on an email, and you say, no problem, no big deal. Yeah, that's an easy answer, but it's also sort of a comment on what you think is a timely email response or not. So we're starting to actually see sort of subtle shifts of these things that are there. But anyway, so sorry, that's the first example that's coming to mind. Sort of maybe more amusing or disturbing one is Val Kilmer, who's no longer with us, but is going to appear in a movie. An AI-generated version of Val Kilmer is going to appear in a movie. And I'll just ask you to think about this image of me in front of this. So are these problems? And your answer might be, no, it's fine. I don't really care about the autocomplete thing. Mike and that family, not a big deal. That's like not going to happen a lot of the times. Val Kilmer, that's for Val Kilmer's lawyers to figure out how to deal with. You may have a relationship to this problem where you're saying, not something that I'm interested in doing. But I would encourage you to sort of say why. If you think something's a problem, have a why. If you think something's not a problem, have a why not. And that's fine. But what it starts to do, those kinds of conversations help us have conversations about AI in ways that are different from just, I guess I have to ask the technologist to train the data set in a different way. It's a kind of an intervention that's there. Okay, so I want to close this out and hopefully leave a little bit of time for questions and conversations, but some ways forward, like how you're gonna go out into the world, AI is gonna happen at you, even if you don't want it to. It's gonna fail, it's gonna break down, you're gonna be upset or not, depending on how things go. But some clues or some ways that you might navigate this problem. So the first is, Arlie Hochschild has this phrase that I love it. She calls, issues can be what she calls keyhole issues. And all a keyhole issue is it's an issue that you look through to see something else. It's an issue that shows you that this is a case of something. So those facial detection algorithms that I was talking about, to me it's like a case of university economics. It's a case of vendors thinking that a fix is actually a fix or not a fix. I can think about it as a case of those things, but get good at understanding what is a AI error a case of, and describe it in that way. The other bit, and related to that, is Richard Rorty, who's an American pragmatist philosopher, but sort of coming out of the school of William Peirce and John Dewey, and actually Harold Innis as well, thinking about these pragmatic moments where what we all have is language. Even if you're not a technologist, what you do have is you have language. You have ways of describing things. You have ways of casting something that you've encountered in the world as something different. And that act of redescription of taking something and re-describing it, and it's going to almost sounds oversimplistic to say, that's a very powerful moment. It's a really powerful moment that you don't need to know a whiff about AI to do, but you can re-describe an error or an encounter in language that matters to you. So use your language. Tell your stories. It's actually an intensely powerful position for you to be able to do that. The other is keep AI flexible. Resist these collapses, these moments where somebody tells you what AI, quote, really is. There's no shortage of those. We tend to give over a lot of the power of storytelling and definition to people with technical training. I would encourage us to push back on that and to sort of say, nope, don't tell me what AI, quote, really is. There's something else going on. I also love this idea of good enough, and this is sort of in the description of this talk a little bit, is get good at recognizing moments of good enough. And I mean good enough in really this ambivalent way. And I want to take on board this ambivalence. There might be moments where some use of generative AI, some piece of media that's produced is good enough for some situation. I mean, I don't mean to, those email auto answers, whatever. We're all busy, we're all grappling with a lot of email. I would never sort of say blanket, don't ever use that, it's not a thing to do. Maybe it's good enough in a moment. But there's other moments where AI maybe is not good enough. It's not good enough for something else. But being able to just use this idea of good enough as a little litmus test, a little voice in your head that says, what is this good enough for? What is it not good enough for? And to set up sort of some of your own sort of personal boundaries there. The others, I'm just trying to give you some language, some phrases that might sort of help here. Donna Haraway, STS scholar. She has a feminist sort of historian and a feminist technology scholar. She says, stay with the trouble, right? Always look for the trouble in systems. Look for the breakdowns, look for the precarity. Try to either define your teaching experiences like that, your conversations with people. There's honestly no shortage of AI celebration. There's a lot of it everywhere, and I don't discount it, and I often really enjoy, especially sort of the artistic potential of a lot of AI systems. That's great, but stay with the trouble. Stay with sort of this idea that errors might be things that are more powerful. And then the last one I'll end with is my friend and colleague Karen Levy, who's at Columbia. It's one of the essays that I link up there, but she has this really wonderful phrase that she says, be precise in your outrage. And Karen is probably one of the most, and I say this in a really loving way, is one of the most righteous, one of the most, I would trust her interpretation of almost any sort of naughty or tricky situation you get into. But what Karen doesn't let herself do is to sort of slide into just sort of imprecise outrage. If she studies technology, she's an STS scholar, she's also trained as a lawyer, she's very multifaceted, and she essentially says, don't come at me with your outrage unless we're ready to get intensely precise about what's gone wrong, what should happen, and demanding that kind of precision, not only of ourselves, but of sort of the communities that we're with, I think can be not only sort of a moment of discipline and sort of a moment of knowing what you're talking about, but I also think it's a moment of good faith. It's a moment of sort of saying, let's make this less about people and sort of idiosyncratic differences or frictions we might have, and let's sort of talk about where the metal is of how these systems are working and why they matter. Okay, I talked a little bit longer than I meant to, but I just wanted to wrap up and say thank you very much for the chance to be here and the chance to talk with you all about this. I really appreciate it. Thanks.